You've no doubt heard the term sex assigned at birth and reacted with a bit of curiosity. How can a sex be assigned? Isn't one born into a sex? Nowadays, many institutions, especially medical institutions, refer to a person's biological sex as their sex assigned at birth.
If the medical person who helps deliver the baby sees a penis, the baby is said to be a boy. If they see a vulva, the baby is said to be a girl. Either way, this determination of a baby's gender is called sex assigned at birth.
This has been from the influence of trans theories, i.e. any theory which believes a person can change their gender and/or their sex characteristics. This has led to quite a bit of consternation from people who are gender critical, i.e. a theory which denies that a person can change their gender and/or sex characteristics.
There is no such thing as a transgender person.
They argue sex isn't assigned, it's observed or acknowledged.
Sex is not assigned at birth. Sex is recognized at birth.
Sex is not assigned at birth, and that's why it can't be reassigned later in life.
Though it should be noted that some trans theorists also agree with this as well. Other trans theorists, though not all, and certainly not myself, will argue biological sex is a pure social construction that is initiated by the utterance of a doctor declaring this baby is male, this baby is female.
Is there something called biological sex, and what does that mean?
Trans women are not biological men.
This idea that the body is either male or female is totally wrong.
A trans woman is a woman. All of her body parts are female body parts.
And also that the observation may be factually wrong. Well, they're both right and they're both wrong. When a doctor declares a baby is male or female, they base that declaration off of an observation of perceived sex characteristics, usually genitalia. A doctor's utterance, which carries the appeal to authority of medical expertise, is the assignation of their observation, which is then placed on legal documents and determines a person's gender, more specifically their relation to gender roles or gender stereotypes. 99% of the time, the observation and assignation correspond, therefore the assignation is true. You see, this is merely how language works. If what we say is true, then language must correspond to reality. The sentence or assignment, I am Zach, is true because it corresponds to the reality that Zach I am. There's a core metaphysical problem being challenged here. Is there a mind-independent reality? Is biological sex something which exists independently of whether humans exist or not? Is there a matter, a material, independent of language? And the answer is yes. Yes, there is. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk! We are beings existing within the world. Even though we can only ever understand meaning through language, this does not necessarily entail that the world is just language games all the way down. The objects we encounter within the world present themselves to us. They present us possible interpretations that are limited by the thing itself, independent of us. Of these multiple interpretations, we as a society develop the normative interpretation, the interpretation that one is expected to have. This does not entail that the normative interpretation is always true. Humanity thought the Earth was at the center of the universe since time immemorial. It is not. If any interpretation errs in its judgment, we do so because we interpret the thing or phenomena outside of its limits. This does not preclude the possibility that a phenomena has multiple interpretations which are true. Sex is a biological, mind-independent reality, and the normative interpretation of its organization...
Sex is a bodily reality. Sex is determined based upon how organisms are organized with respect to sexual reproduction.
...is true because we describe the phenomena of biological sex within the limits it presents itself. At the same time, this is not the only possible permutation which is true. Believing this does not invalidate trans theory, or trans people, or intersex people. I mean, except for linguistic monus. But the question does remain, what limits does this interpretation place on other interpretations? For instance, now a trans theorist might say for trans people, their sex observed at birth does not match the assignation of that sex, but this presumes too much. One, if this were true, then biological sex would not be determined by a constellation of all the different sex characteristics, most of which are not socially constructed, but by some other ethereal thing like a person's gender identity, something which at birth is arguably imperceptible. 2. It erases transsexuals, i.e. trans people who medically transition from one biological sex to another. An essential characteristic of a transsexual's history is they have transitioned away from their birth sex, meaning they had to actually be born with the sex characteristics they are removing or rendering functionless in order to be transsexual. 3. If sex and gender are distinct things, then, for non-transsexual transgender people, they only transition to different gender expressions, but do not change their biological sex characteristics, and the observation and assignation of their birth sex continue to correspond to each other. Also, what sex characteristics any specific person has is scientifically none of your business unless you're in the medical community or a person's lover community. Gender is assigned based on the observation of biological sex. We are assigned into a gender category, usually masculinity or femininity, and are expected to express gendered characteristics for the gender you were assigned to, i.e., all of those social characteristics that are believed to come from a person's biological sex, but usually only have a tangential relation to reproduction proper. One is born into a sex, and they are assigned to a gender. What people really mean by assigned female at birth, AFAB, or assigned male at birth, AMAB, is assigned feminine at birth or assigned masculine at birth, which thankfully has the same acronyms. So you know, that's nice. I actually think the only people who are assigned a biological sex at birth incorrectly from the observation is intersex people, or people born with incongruent sex characteristics. I'll put a link in the description about intersex people if you want to learn more. Also, just because you were born or labeled a certain thing at birth doesn't mean you are eternally that thing. I was born like 9 pounds, but am no longer 9 pounds. I was also born a boy, but now I'm a man. And what about the assignation of gender at birth based on sex determination? Does this still hold? Well, some trans theorists might say we are all born with a gender identity separate from gender roles and gender expressions. What this inborn identity actually is can be difficult to nail down, like Jell-O. Some might argue that gender identity is merely the sex characteristic of the brain. Under this schema, a trans dude was born in a female body but has a male brain, and this incongruence is what causes gender dysphoria, which can be alleviated by transitioning. Others seem to assume, and I'm sure I'm probably straw-personing some people's arguments, that gender identity is some type of inborn image like a soul, maybe, and that's where the incongruence comes from. Do souls have a gender? Leave an answer in the comments. Honestly, I'm super skeptical of the brain being born with a certain sex, or that the brain even has a sex. Neurologically, it appears that, if there actually are sexually dimorphic brain characteristics, people are born as bibis with a mosaic of both male and female traits, which change over time in relation to one's environment. Though, this is not purely neutral, and most people seem to have more male traits than female traits or vice versa. I don't think a gender identity prior to being categorized in a role and gaining the knowledge of gendered expressions even makes sense. So, I don't think anyone is born with a specific gender identity. A person is assigned a gendered role, and through the continuous reiterations of gender expressions, develops a gender identity that is relatively stable, that can be very rigid in some people and more fluid in others. The recognition of gendered traits seems to occur very early on in an infant's development. By the age of 4, most children seem to have developed a gender identity, including trans children. In fact, studies show that the age of epiphany for 76% of trans people, i.e. the epiphany that something is horribly wrong with their sex and or gender, happens prior to leaving primary school, usually spiking around the age of 5.
When I see a child who, believes in Santa Claus, and then let's say this is a boy and he says, I'm a girl. This is someone who can't distinguish between fantasy and reality, so.
These studies weren't based on surveys of children who still believe in Santa Claus, but adults reflecting on their lives. people definitely seem to be born with certain predispositions toward gendered expressions that their embodiment either attaches onto or rejects. Otherwise, how would trans people raised in very cisnormative and transphobic families and communities still develop into being trans? So, for 98 to 99% of people, the observation of sex and the assignment is true. And for 97% to 98% of people, that assignment remains true throughout a person's life. Whether you say observe sex at birth, or assign sex at birth, or just say a person is born this sex or that sex, it all means the same thing. But I might be wrong about all this. I'm just sketching out some strange thinking is all. Thanks for watching my ramblings. Thanks to all my patrons. And I'll see you the next time you get lost in one of my strange corners of thought. Bye.
you